Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. My name is Rebecca and I will be monitoring the chat and helping if you have any technical issues throughout. Today we'll be focusing on the FME platform, Managing Database and Web Connections 101. Your host for today will be Ian Fletcher and I will hand over to him shortly. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You will all been placed on mute. However, we welcome your comments and questions by typing them into the question panel. We will address these at the end of today's webinar in the Q&A session. If we don't get a chance to answer your question, don't worry, we'll follow up with you afterwards. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded and we will share this with you after the webinar via a link in the email. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Ian Fletcher and I am a senior FME consultant here at OneSpatial. Today's webinar is all about database and web connections within the FME product suite. What are they? What are the advantages of using them? And most importantly, how you can use them in your own workspaces and projects to make your own applications more efficient and easy to manage. There we go. Before we get stuck in, here's just a little bit of background about ourselves here at OneSpatial. So OneSpatial is a spatial solutions provider with our head office here in Cambridge, UK, but we also have a number of offices across the globe. We work with customers within many key industry sectors, such as utilities, transport, engineering, and both local and national governments to help them meet their geospatial needs with a mix of proprietary and third-party software applications. And we have a number of technology partners that we work very closely with, including Safe Software, the producers of the FME family of products, which we are discussing today. Within OneSpatial, we have a dedicated FME team, and we've been working with and reselling FME for quite a while now. So we provide support for all of the FME products from FME desktop through to server and FME cloud. And we also incorporate FME into a number of our own custom solutions. Within the FME division, we have a team of skilled FME operators, many of whom are certified directly with SAFE. So chances are we can help you with any FME related issues that you might have. So in way of introduction, let's get stuck straight in. So let's begin first with a little bit of an introduction to data translation in the world of FME. As hopefully we all know, one of the main benefits of using FME to connect and transform data is the support for a vast range of formats that comes with the software. So if we go to safe.com/integrate, we can see a full list of the 450 plus compatible formats currently available for use. And this list is always growing with every version of FME that is released. So it's always worth keeping an eye on the release notes and the documentation to stay up to date. But the point is, no matter where your data is and in what format, FME is likely to be the tool that you will need to access it. So let's start by defining what a database connection is in the first place. So many common formats that you might wish to use, including Excel spreadsheets, shape files, mapinfo tab files, will only require you to add a file or a folder pathway in order to connect to the dataset. Often you may be required to add additional parameters in order to read the features correctly, such as the delimiting character in a CSV, but broadly speaking, the file pathway itself is the only mandatory connection parameter stored against many of the formats within a workspace. If the directory of the source data changes, so should the file pathway reference within the workspace. There are, however, many more complicated exceptions to this, where additional connection parameters are required before a connection can be made. Each format may have its own unique set of parameters, which will need to be populated in the readers and the writers that we bring into the canvas. Often this can be just a username or a password if the database is encrypted, but each format is slightly different. So above we see two instances of databases that require additional connection information in this way. So on the left we have an Oracle spatial reader that requires you to add a service name or connection string a username and a password before a connection is allowed. And on the right, we have a Postgres reader that needs a host name, a port number, and then also a username and a password. Similarly, when you wish to connect to an online service through an HTTP caller or a dedicated connector transformer, authentication is required before you can stream data to and from these services, and user parameters need to be stored against the transformer they relate to. And it's the way that these database and web connections are stored and managed within FME desktop and server that is the focus of today's webinar. Let's take a closer look at database connections first. So commonly within a production workspace, you will have multiple connections and readers and writers, with each reader and writer within a workspace requiring its own authentication parameters. This can really quickly become cumbersome to manage and update if multiple connections are required. So in the above example, the same Postgres database is referenced 4 separate times, and thus typically the user might be expected to enter the same connection parameters in multiple places. Obviously, this is really inefficient, and certainly with large workspaces or in environments where connection parameters are changed regularly, this could easily lead to issues if connection parameters change without being updated in the workspace. So instead of prompting you to enter and re-enter the same authentication information multiple times, FME allows you to create a named database or web connection, which allows you to store the relevant information once and then recycle it as many times as you need to within a workspace. Database connections are therefore much more manageable than individually authenticated readers and writers. Each time you need to use a connection in a workspace, you either can use a saved database connection already existing, or you can recreate a new named connection and then just use the parameters each time you need them. Furthermore, if the authentication details change or need to be recreated, they can be edited in a single place rather than within each referenced reader or writer. Regardless of the format that you wish to connect to, creating a database connection in FME follows a very simple process. So when you initially bring a reader or a writer onto the canvas that requires a connection, the Add Dialog window will remain red until a connection is added. Using the connection drop-down, you can either then select an existing connection, or as we will demonstrate here, you can have the ability to create an entirely new one. So selecting the add new connection option will bring up a further dialog box where database-specific parameters can be populated. And then you can use the test tool, which I've highlighted at the bottom of the window here, to confirm that the parameters are valid before continuing on and saving the connection. So once the database connection has been validated and given a name, hit save to store the parameters as a named connection within the workspace. And then once created, this named connection can be selected from the drop-down in this transformer and subsequent processes that require the same connection details. Additional table information and where clauses can be set up under the parameters tab, depending on the format that you're looking at. But broadly speaking, at this point, the writer is ready to use. So after a connection has been made, FME makes it incredibly easy to manage and recycle existing connections for later use. So in the navigator window, you can see a summary list of all the connections currently used within the workspace. And here, connection parameters can be changed, which makes it very easy to switch between target databases without having to manually open up each transformer. Some further useful functionality is also available if you open up the database connections within the FME options tab. Here, existing connections are listed, and you can either add or remove connections, edit existing connection parameters, or switch connections between public and private visibility. And this is a function which is not active by default, but might be worth considering depending on the requirements of your organization. And just to elaborate on that a bit, the public versus private connection functionality is really, really useful when wishing to share some connections with others, some connections, sorry, with colleagues, but not others. So for example, you might have a workspace with a reader trying to connect to an organization-wide Postgres database for everyone to access, and then a writer passing data into your own personal Dropbox account. So in this example, if the workspace is shared with a colleague, you may wish to keep the SharePoint connection public, but make the Dropbox connection private. In this scenario, your colleague would not have to re-enter the connection details for the Postgres database, but would need to use their own connections to make a credential, their own credentials to make a connection to Dropbox. So by default, connections created within a workspace are only available to the user which has created them, which means by default, if we were to share a workspace that included a private web connection, the workspace itself would fail to run and the connection would have to be manually rebuilt. So looking in the FME options, we can see that the default pathway for both public and private keys is set to a single private directory, which is only accessible to this specific user. This means if the workspace was shared with another user, all the required connections would have to be manually rebuilt a second time, which obviously is not particularly efficient. But obviously, if we we can fix this. So if we wish to create a public connection directory, all we need to do is go to the specified pathway where we can see the private and public keys that are stored as a number of separate files. So to create a connection which is transferable to anyone within an organization, firstly, the public keys need to be moved into a directory which is shared. And then once the files have been moved, the public key pathway can be changed in the FME options dialog box. Then if you restart FME, reopen the database and web connections tab, you should be able to see that the option to set a connection to public is now been enabled. And then by toggling various connections off and on, a user can control which connections are moved into the public key file and are thus available to anyone else to access, anyone else to use that has access to the shared directory. Sometimes you may wish to share a connection with a user outside of your network, or you may wish to share an otherwise private connection with a single named user. And in both cases, it might be unsuitable to use to make a connection public. So there are various other options available to you if this is the case. Firstly, by right-clicking on a connection that you wish to share within the connections window, an individual connection can be exported as an XML file. After setting an export location, you get the option to include your login credentials and also to set an optional password on the output file for additional security if you wish. And then once exported, this XML file can be shared with anyone you wish and re-imported within the same window. And this is a great way of communicating connection settings to users who might not have access to a public connections directory, however, does have the disadvantage of requiring a manual re-export if the connection details subsequently change. Finally, connections can be embedded so that the connection parameters always sit within the workspace, regardless of whoever is running it and from where. So perhaps you wish to share a workspace with another organization with different security protocols, which means that making a connection via a public directory is not an option. In the navigator window, you can differentiate between embedded versus private connections by the parameters stored against the individual format. So in this case here, we can see an embedded connection at the top, where each of the individual connection parameters is stored separately against the Postgres writer. And at the bottom, we have the equivalent named connection, where all you get is the parameter which links that particular reader to your named connection. So much simpler to view. Finally, just by right-clicking on a connection within a navigator, connections can be flipped between embedded and named depending on the requirements. Embedding a transformer is a useful way of creating a fully contained workspace which anyone can use straight out of the box, as you have a self-contained a file that has no external connection dependencies. Again, this connection will then therefore require manual maintenance if the connection details change, but is a really good way of sharing workspaces, especially with users who may be less familiar with FME as a tool to manage and edit. So yeah, that's broadly speaking some of the basics of database connections. Let's now have a look at web connections. And these perform a very similar function to database connections, but allow users to connect to an online service, which requires some form of authentication. FME has the ability to connect to many different, many common web services, some of whom are listed here. Web connections can be used to connect directly to an API, for example, by using a GET request in an HTTP caller, or through a dedicated connector transformer that has been published as a managed web service within FME. Creating and managing a new web connection follows a lot of the basic procedural steps required in creating a new database connection. However, there are additional authentication steps that you will have to step through. So let's go through the two basic ways in which you can create a web connection. The easiest way to get started with web connections is to use one of the dedicated connector transformers listed within the gallery. And these exist for many of the most common web services and create a simple GUI for many of the basic API functions that sit behind the web service. And so depending on the functionality of the web service in question, these connectors will commonly allow you to download, upload, and list data within one of these services. When you add a new connector to a workspace, the red cog reveals that additional parameters are required. So to use a connector, as we can see here, a web connection is required to log onto the service and authenticate the user. And you can add a new web connection from the drop-down or select one that has already been created from the list of options. Adding a new web connection will bring up the connection dialog box, and here we see some information about the Dropbox API that we're trying to connect to, along with information about the web connection that we're trying to create. So after giving the web connection a name and assigning a public or private visibility in the same way that we do with database connections, the connection will then ask you to authenticate, at which point a new pop-up will open requiring you to sign into the service with the necessary user account details. And this will associate a web service account with the particular application, which is a necessary step in securely authenticating the connection to the web service with FME. Some services will then require some additional two-factor authentication steps, but once completed, the connection is ready to use. The connector cog is now blue, and the web connection itself is visible in the navigator pane, where it can be reused elsewhere in the workspace or replaced with a different account. So once authentication is complete, you can typically log directly into the service that you've just connected to and view the connected applications within your account. And this is usually displayed alongside a list of the permissions subsequently granted and the ability to revoke access to the web app if necessary. Creating a web connection through an HTTP caller is just as simple. However, without a dedicated connector, you will have to know a little bit more about structuring an API call in order to use it. So again, under the use authentication option at the bottom of the HTTP caller parameters window, you can select an existing web connection or a new connection if required. Regardless of which method you use, the connection between the FME workspace and the web application relies upon a client ID and a token to be generated and stored against the web service in question. Clicking on Managed Services will bring up a list of all of the web services available to you, either pre-installed with desktop or available to download from the hub. And you will notice by default that some of these already have pre-populated client secrets and IDs, and this is because Safe Software has created many pre-approved applications for use with these services and have therefore subsequently generated secrets and IDs in the background. So for the purposes of testing, this is usually sufficient. Just use the supplied client ID and secret. However, if you ever wish to move away from a testing or sandbox environment, it is usually advisable to create your own application token and secret, and we'll see an example of this in a minute. Each application will be slightly different, but broadly speaking, when you log into a web service and create an application, you often get a choice to create a free application with limited functionality or bandwidth before a user is asked to apply for a paid production service. And this is a great way of testing out the functionality before investing any further. Once an application is created, it should appear in the web service app list alongside the Safe Software app if you have also already connected that to your account. Using the token and secret generated by the app that you have just created, a new web service connection can be created from a list of the templates. It's always advisable not to overwrite existing safe generated secrets. Instead, a new connection with a different name can be created from an existing template using the create from tool at the bottom left of the window. Once the custom web service has been created, it should then be available to use when creating a new web connection within a transformer that relies upon this service. So a final word on web connections here. As I mentioned, FME Desktop comes with many pre-installed connections and templates from which to choose from. However, additional material is available to download from hub.safe.com. Here you will find additional web connection templates which can be downloaded and installed for use in your FME environment. Let's have a look at a quick demo I've created just to kind of put this in practice. So here we've got a very simple workspace which is using an HTTP caller to connect to the Strava API and bring back some information. And for those who are not aware, Strava is an application for logging logging runs and cycle routes that you complete. So let me just switch windows. So to use this, the first thing I have done in the background is to create a new Strava application, Strava app within my account. So you can see it's my personal account. We've created an application and it's generated a client ID and a client secret. And then you can see this is a free account, so the rate is limited to 100 requests every 15 minutes, which for the purposes of what we're doing here is perfectly fine. So I've taken this client ID and secrets, and then if I just switch again, there we go. So this is the same workspace. If we then look in web connections and managed services, you should see, yep. So I've taken that data and populated it here, and this means that this web service is now available for use. So what I can now do, if I cancel this, within the HTTP caller in the workspace, so I've pre-populated the API. I can go to use authentication, go to web connections. Strava web connection hasn't been created yet, so let's create a new one. Let's go down to our Strava web service that we've just looked at. Give it a nice name, demo. I'm going to make it visible just to me because this is my private Strava account. And then I said we're going to authenticate. This is going to bring up a very unhelpful window. Let's click that. So let's just log in. I'm going to log into my private account. So if I can remember my surname, obviously. Yep. Okay, is that going to log me in? Yep, okay, and as I mentioned, it's now asking for some two-factor authentication, which I'm just completing on my phone. Yes, it is me. Okay, responded on my phone. It's now hopefully, yes, okay, so I've successfully linked my Strava account to this application, and you can see the permissions that I have to grant in order to authorize and use this API. So let's click authorize, and hopefully, yeah, it's now working. So if we so firstly, as I mentioned, we can see now this web connection in the navigator pane, and if we click play, hopefully it's going to work. Give it a minute, obviously. I hope it does. Yep, fantastic. So it's pulled out some information from the Strava API using the web connection that we've created. And hopefully in a minute, if it loads, yes, okay. So hopefully the background map will load, but here you can see yeah, there we go. Right, here's the last 2 runs that I created, I completed in central London. So yeah, it's worked, and that's a nice little example of how to create a web connection. So let's just go back to the slides. Oh, no, where are we? There we go. Okay, so that's the demo out of the way. So finally, let's have a look at how database and web connections are managed as and when a workspace has been uploaded to either FME server or FME cloud. If a workspace is published with a dependency on a connection, it is vital that that connection is either embedded within the workspace or published as a named connection within the server environment itself. So once uploaded to server or cloud, the database and web connections will be available to access from the Files and Connections menu on the left-hand side. If a connection needs to be edited, it can either be done so directly in server by clicking on a named connection, or managed in FME desktop and republished using the publication tool. When edited in desktop, FME will recognize if an existing connection has already been published to server, and will disable the upload of that connection by default. If you were then to just tick re-enable that upload, it will prompt FME to republish an updated connection, but with an additional warning underneath highlighting that something is about to be overwritten. One other thing to bear in mind when using connections within server and cloud is that the permissions granted to a user or a role will determine the level of access to external web and database connections available to them. So existing permissions can be viewed under the user management tab, and this is where the various connection permissions can be edited if necessary. So to trigger a workspace in server which contains a connection, at a minimum, a user needs access permission granted. However, to publish a workspace with a new connection, a user will need to be granted create permission. So just in way of a wrap up, here's a short list of things that we have looked at on our whistle stop tour today. So we started with a broad overview of what a database or web connection is, and the function of and the fundamental concepts of these connections within the FME environment. We've demonstrated how to flip between public and private connections and the various ways of sharing a connection, and the advantages and disadvantages of all these methods. And then we took a look at the ways in which web connections and templates can be managed and downloaded from the Safe Software Hub. And then finally, we briefly looked at the various considerations you have to make when using connections within a server environment. As always, the Safe Software website is a fantastic place to go when looking for further information. I've linked in, to some of the articles and documentation that I've used in the construction of this presentation, and we will make sure that these are sent out to users after this presentation is over. If you want to know more, obviously there's multiple different options available to you. There are multiple training and webinar options listed at onespatial.com/training or on-demand webinars. It's always a great idea to have a look at the FME community at safe.com/community. Q&A forum, you can ask the community directly for help, and often you can get a reply in minutes. Or of course, you can contact us directly. If you already have an active maintenance and support agreement with us, please feel free to email support@onespatial.com, and hopefully we will be able to help you with any of your queries. And with that, thank you very much for listening to me, and I will now open up to any questions if there are any in the chat. So let's have a quick look. Just one private message. Does FME Cloud behave in the same way as FME Server when publishing? Yes. So at FME, in the way that connections are managed, FME Cloud will behave in exactly the same way as Server. You still have to make the same considerations about permissions and as you would within Server. Rebecca, are there any others in the questions tab?
Yep, we have one more question here, which is we have an FME server running in an Azure Kubernetes cluster. Is it possible to use Azure Managed Identity Authentication for authentication to databases? And if it is possible, how can I implement that?
Off the top of my head, I think that is possible, although the details of which I will have to look up. So I think that question, it's probably best if I go away and reply by email. But yeah, I'll get some information to you directly.
Thank you.
Anything else? No. Well, I think. Oh no.
Nope,
so was
no
that
more
someone?
questions.
Lovely.
No
well, yeah. Well, with that, thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and yeah, I guess have a very Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Bye bye.